So Owen just did a pretty interesting live stream. I haven't seen the whole thing yet. I've gotten through the first part of it, which I'm going to comment on because I thought it brought together a few interesting topics. And one of the things he mentioned was God, gold, and Newton. And I thought this kind of intersects pretty well with Jordan Peterson and some of the things he's been talking about, and a couple of things that have been on my mind that I haven't gotten to talk about recently, but I've been meaning to. So without further ado, I'm going to let Owen sort of start the conversation, and then I'll comment.
Anyway, so the deterministic worldview, which started way back in the day in Königsberg with David Hilbert, von Neumann, Kurt Gödel, they thought that you could determine the world. And that was disproven. I know there's a lot of mathematicians out there. Like Coddington Bear is a legitimate mathematician, so he's probably pulling his hair out at how I'm describing this right now, but it's wrong. Like chaos theory emerged out of this because there's so many factors in life that you can't figure out what will happen. You can't predict the future. Like even all these global warming models are all off. You can't determine billiard balls on a pool table accurately because there's so many factors. And I believe in a soul, a spark of divinity. I think human beings are special. And
notice how he still uses the term that Peterson brought to the public, spark of divinity. I know that comes from a certain sect of Christianity. I can't remember the name right now. Everybody knows it, and it's on the tip of my tongue. I just can't remember it right now. But I think, was it the Quakers? Yeah, maybe the Quakers got that idea of they call it the spark of divinity, whereas most people classically call it the imago Dei, the image of God. This, comes right out of the Old Testament. So he still uses that language. I'm sure that's how he became, familiar with it, like many people did, if they're fans of Jordan Peterson. And perhaps they weren't that much into religion before they heard Jordan Peterson. So he's still using that term there. And he's also talking about determinism. Obviously he's reading this information from somewhere. I'm not sure what his source is nor the validity of what the information is saying. I'm not really here to argue about what he's saying, just more comment on some of the more interesting things. So the topic he's bringing up is determinism. So do we have free will or not? And Owen's position is that humans cannot be calculated like every inanimate object can with physics. Now he's saying we can't even calculate billiard balls accurately, but I'm sure the distinction is that we can calculate billiard balls accurately using the rules of physics, and using mathematics and so forth, but we can't calculate human beings accurately because they're more than billiard balls. They're more than just matter and energy, right? So he's saying there's a soul, and this soul is what makes a difference in our outlook and in our disposition, in how we interact with each other, and how people on high, let's say in government or corporations, because he's going to bring up Google, can't calculate what a human being is going to do. Now, this is actually a very difficult position for me, and I'm going to just be talking a little bit about the other side. I'm going to try to Iron Man the other side, if you will, about determinism, even though it's not my natural position per se, but it is something that I struggle with. So I'll let him continue.
I believe in God, and I think that this is the irony. This is such an interesting topic that I sound like I'm just stammering and stuttering, and I don't really know how to get into it. Okay, let's start with the cloud. So what happened? I just watched this interview with the WikiLeaks creator Julian Assange. He was talking about the different business model that is going to emerge with Google, where it was about ads and clicks, and then it became about the cloud, and now it's going to be about AI, like predicting human behavior. And it's a much bigger market, a lot of money, but there's a failure in it. And that's what George Gilder is talking about, because you can't. You can't predict human behavior. It's impossible. Look at Hillary Clinton's election. They had all of the biggest Silicon Valley think tanks and algorithms on that, and just this random guy who's kind of a dick and pretty funny just beat her.
So he brings up an interesting point about Trump's election and how all the models were saying that he was going to lose and so forth, and all the stats were against him, so to speak. But I think what we ultimately saw was how biased a pollster could be, how biased stats could get, even though it's just math. There are men and women behind the numbers who are gathering the numbers, who are calculating the numbers, and who are creating the models that the numbers are used in. And we can see just how biased certain kinds of sciences, quote unquote, can be. That there is a subjective value, and people's biases were being laid upon the, quote, objective numbers. And I think it's a great instance of that, if you want to look at it that way. And I think someone like Carl Jung might have predicted Trump's election. Someone like Jordan Peterson is trying to probe the Democrats and ask them, like, so what are you going to do about the other half of the country? If you win, or again, if you lose again, because he might be seeing something that the rest of us are not seeing, if we're not seeing clearly. I think if you read some of Carl Jung's collected works, Aeon, and the book before that, I think it's volume 9, Collected Works 9, volume 1, The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious. If you read that, you're going to see almost, you can pretty much lay out the election between the masculine and feminine vying for dominance, and so forth. I didn't really prepare a speaking point, a talking point about that, but it just seems to come to mind that Carl Jung might have been able to predict the election, and human beings overall, I think, are generally predictable in the sense that given certain stimulus, you're more likely than not to get a certain outcome. Now, Jordan Peterson was arguing with Sam Harris about this a little bit, but about ethics and how you can extrapolate ethics. Because Sam Harris was saying, look, a human being, 99 times out of 100 or 9,999 times out of 10,000 is not going to put his hand on a red-hot stove. But then Jordan countered that by saying, well, they will if it's to save their child, you see. So, and then what the right and wrong position is about that, ethically. So I think given certain stimulus, you're going to get a more likely than not outcome. Again, it's about the context for human beings. And we sort of have this, we have a bias against machines and against looking at ourselves as machines. And I see both sides of this. If you've listened to my Fearful Symmetry series, I talk about William Blake, and he rails against the Lockean view that started all of this virtually. This idea that the metaphor has changed. If you listen to the Roos and Lennox debate, Michael Roos says that one of the things that has changed through the Industrial Revolution is the metaphor of man has changed. We went from, let's say, a divine being to a machine. The machine is now the metaphor for the human. Our brains are like computers and so forth. And if you want to, that sort of struggled with what the metaphor Darwin sort of brought to us again, was that we come from apes, or we come from animals. Our ancestry lies in the slime of the oceans, not from the God above in the sky. So there's these vying metaphors, and with the machine one, I definitely understand why we should not view ourselves as machines, but I also think we should understand the benefits to that. And I think the benefits, you see that in medicine and technology and technological medicine, is that when you start breaking things down part by part and piece by piece, you can start to zero in on certain things and let's say cure them, or find therapies for what's going on. And so there are advantages to that. And if you really look at some of our parts do look very actually mechanical, if you want to put that in quotations. Besides that, this sort of links into Yuval Harari's article from a few weeks ago about how we're going to have to give up our notion of free will if we're going to survive the next 100 years, basically, as corporations and governments get hold of very strong AI that can sort of predict our reactions to things and then feed us the stimulus that we need or require to get us to act certain ways. So now Owen thinks this is impossible, so maybe he's not afraid of the governments and big corporations getting this kind of AI that can help predict and stimulate human behavior. But I think, and I argue against Yuval Harari's article, and I've been wanting to do a close reading of that and give my take of it. But I do agree to a large extent about what he's saying. I just disagree with some of his presuppositions of what we think free will is to begin with, and why we would have to give up that notion, because I think he's using an incorrect definition of free will. But anyway, so if you look at, so how can corporations, well, I'll let Owen talk a little bit more before I get into how corporations can know us better than we know ourselves. Maybe he says it in the next minute or two.
So the cloud requires an unbelievable amount of infrastructure to keep all this data. So when we think of the cloud, we just think of a cloud, and we think of all our information goes up there and we just pull it down when we need it. No, they have 80 locations, and the amount of energy that it requires and the heat it produces and the cooling it requires means that most of these locations for the Google information, the metadata, big data as they like to call it, have to be near a reservoir and a dam, because they require just an insane amount of cooling and electricity, and they can't keep it up.
I thought this was kind of interesting. As civilizations develop and societies develop, they do have to be near sources of water. And you see, like, the greatest cities, and as they develop through history, they're always on some kind of water. They always have access to some kind of water, because historically water has been necessary to move goods, to move people, for defense or whatever, for trade. There's so many benefits to having your major cities near a body of water, at least historically. And now it's happening again. We're going through the same kind of evolutionary steps of development, but we're doing it in this technological way. And yet, even though it's so high tech, it still goes back to that body of water, and there's something to that I can't quite put my finger on just yet.
Because the way innovation happens, it's exponential, and when you're looking at numbers, it's fine. But when you actually have to build the infrastructure to keep it becomes a problem. And here is when the neo-Marxist theory bites them in the ass. The founders of Google are Marxists. They're neo-Marxists. And one of the biggest problems with these people, which was a problem with Marx, is that they think that that's the end of the line. This is actually a problem with certain religious ideologies as well. It's the belief that you're living in the end times. The belief that there's no more innovation in economics, that there's no more human growth. Like, Marx thought that we may be living in the end times, but you can't determine that. You're just a person. And you can't live that way, and that is a flawed way to live. It's almost narcissistic. And when Marx was around, the Industrial Revolution made things so efficient that he felt that that was the end of need. That we could produce so much stuff so cheaply that no one would ever need anything as long as you distributed it properly. So the issue went from production to distribution. And he's like, it's done. There's no more. He couldn't have possibly thought up the computers, the computer age, the digital age, the information age. The next age that looks like that's coming is the blockchain age, which we'll get to in a second. But Google is having the same problem. Google thinks that it's over. So now we have so much wealth and so much information, so much technology that we should have a universal income to keep the us cows, us cattle just chewing on cud in the field, and they get to live these billionaire lifestyles and go to Mars with Elon Musk, and they're doing good for the world. And that's not true. There's a lot of problems with this way of looking at the world, because what it does is it dehumanizes the individual. That's why we're seeing a remarkable decrease in innovation.
So there's several interesting points there that he brings up. I don't want to nitpick at what he has to say, but rather about the general ideas. It actually sort of coincides with something I'm reading in Ratzinger's Introduction to Christianity, and this kind of also ties back into my video, The Peterson Paradox 2, about truth, and how Heidegger was talking about truth and its origins in Greece and Greek philosophy, and how Greek philosophy kind of took a turn towards one way of looking at truth, and not towards the perhaps more original way of looking at truth. And then, eventually Ratzinger kind of is trying to lay out in broad strokes a kind of history of philosophy and religion, and how truth plays a part in that. And one of the things that kind of crops up is this idea that truth is no longer something that we find or discover, it's something that we make. And Marx played a role in this. And so it's something that we're going to bring about. And so we're going to bring about paradise, we're going to bring about utopia, we're going to make truth. And this making is very much in line with the materialist view, where we're going to not just make an internet, or make a computer, or make a fancy car or fancy house or whatever like that. We're going to remake ourselves. We're no longer going to be man in the image of God. We're going to be man in our own image. Okay, and like I said, Ratzinger has some interesting things to say about that. But here's a little quote. I'm just trying to pull it up quickly as Owen was speaking there, and sort of right around where Ratzinger's talking about sort of three general conceptions, worldviews, if you want to say it that way. It's the polytheistic, monotheistic, and atheistic worldview. And so he's saying, for materialism, the absolute, being matter, is devoid of all personal predicates and can in no way be brought into contact with the concepts of call and answer. This is the idea that we hear in the gospel the call to faith, and we answer back with belief. The most one could say is that man himself must liberate what is divine from matter, so that he would then no longer have God behind him as something that had gone before him, but only in front of him as something to be creatively affected by him, as his own better future. I thought that was kind of interesting, and I'm really liking that Ratzinger book, Introduction to Christianity. If you're one of the bears or a fan of Owen, I know he recently talked about Tolstoy, which I want to do a short video reading the passages that he wanted to read but were just a little bit too heavy for a live stream. I would also recommend Ratzinger's Introduction to Christianity. It's really soaked in a lot of philosophy and theology and history from the last 1,000 years or two, since people have been doing theology. So if you're familiar with that, you're going to see every sentence is kind of laden with the last 2,000 years of theology. So I've been finding it really good, a really interesting book. But so Owen also touched on not just this idea of how Marx and the materialists are creating, trying to create utopia, trying to create truth, I think as Ratzinger would put it, but they're trying to use a universal income to keep the masses sort of at bay. And there's many takes on that. At first, I was very concerned about the talk of a universal basic income, but I think even if you're a free market person, there are ways of looking at it that are not so scary. I still haven't made up my mind about it one way or the other. I tend to disagree with having a universal basic income and see it as a little bit of a moral problem, but I do admit there are other ways of looking at it, and I'm still open to considering all the different ways that you can sort of cut it.
It's not like it used to be. Like the iPhone, the new iPhone, just like the last one.
Oh yeah, and so he was bringing up how innovation is not happening like it used to happen. If you ever watch Peter Thiel talk, he's given a few talks over the years recently that are on YouTube, and he loves to bring this up, and he makes a really strong case for the lack of innovation across the board in every kind of domain, in every field. There's been a lack of innovation, and he has a number of stats and sort of benchmarks that he uses to make the point really well. So I would just highly suggest look up some of Peter Thiel's talks, some of his recent ones. I think he did one in Germany recently that's very, I think it's only an hour long, but he lays it all out there very well. And so I think this might be what Owen Benjamin is referencing, something along those lines. And it's interesting because Eric Weinstein, he's one of he manages Peter Thiel's investment fund, I think. So I don't know how these ideals are filtering through, and how much is Eric Weinstein talking there, how much is Peter Thiel himself talking. Of course, both are legitimate geniuses, so I'm sure they can both come up with their own view. But Owen is now repeating something along those lines.
Except the headphones go where you're supposed to put the plug. And I tried to get into Android, but it was a struggle. Like the Bear phone is Android and it makes texting very hard or whatever, but we're not innovating at the pace that they want. They have these ideals and Darwin made humans animals, and Google made AI God. And this is a problem because determinism cannot.
I like that phrase. I don't know if that's original to Owen, but that's a really interesting way of putting it.
Not factor in the soul or consciousness. For atheists can call it consciousness. Religious people can call it a soul. But it's that spark that makes human beings special. And we have it. We're not just billiard balls on a pool table. We are the reflection of God. Or if you're an atheist, you have consciousness. And when you don't empower the individual to be an individual, you don't innovate anymore, and you start seeing the world in a way that it isn't. And just like we saw with Elizabeth Warren, it bites you in the ass. One of the reasons I don't lie is it's half morality, but morality isn't as strong a force as it should be sometimes. But I know lies always come back, and they make you look ridiculous. And liars can't apologize for some reason. If you look at Hillary Clinton and all these people, they can't just say sorry and move on with their lives. Because once you've committed to the lie, you can't stop. Like Elizabeth Warren, it turned out she's 1/1000th possibly Colombian. Like, I'm more Native American. I'm more American Indian than she is, and I'm not American Indian. I'm very white. And she not only couldn't say sorry, she demanded Trump apologize because they're in a lie. And you see it when you're not in a lie, you can see it in other people very easily. And those people don't understand how easy it is for us mortals to see through their BS because they believe they're God. And so when Google and Silicon Valley is currently living a lie that human beings are demographics, that human beings can be predicted, that human beings, they can make AI that knows us more than we know us.
Well, here's my struggle. I really think there's something to this. One of the things they're working on, so how can an AI, how can a computer know you better than you know yourself, or know you better than your spouse knows you, or something like that? One of the interesting things is the device that you're carrying with you all the time, the device you're staring at for so many hours of each day. You're not staring at your spouse those hours of the day. Your spouse isn't with you all those hours of the day typically. And are you even aware of what you're doing all those hours of the day? Probably not. You're not even self-aware. Okay, but the machine is aware. It's always aware. Now, this is, of course, I'm saying aware, but it's not exactly that. But the machine is listening now to you. It's picking up, and I see this regularly if I go onto Pinterest or I don't know what other thing I go on, but Pinterest typically is what I use. And it'll pop up with, I was listening to a Joe Rogan podcast one time and he was talking about shrooms, about the psychoactive mushrooms. And all of a sudden, as I was scrolling through Pinterest, the pictures of the mushrooms came up. And this is something I've never searched, something I have a subtle interest in after seeing the Rogan podcast and what Jordan Peterson has said about it. It sounds very interesting. But I've never actually searched for it. So there's no way Pinterest would have seen, my search data or anything. It heard that. And I've seen many instances of that happen over the past year or maybe two, where, and Facebook ads, same thing with Facebook ads, it'll hear something I'm talking about with a coworker, and then let's say I'm talking about raincoats, and I've never searched for a raincoat, but all of a sudden I'm going to see, as I scroll through Facebook, an ad for a raincoat, right? So the machine is listening to you. It's listening to everything that's being said around you. It's listening to everything you say. So right now it's at a very rudimentary stage, but imagine when the machine can actually understand you. Perhaps in some way we can already see something like this in the Watson that won Jeopardy, where it starts to actually understand subtleties of language and understand in the way that a human would, and actually more than a human would. So once we get to that level, and I know people like to rag on progress, and in some ways we are not progressing as fast as we used to, I think, but we can see the progress of these machine learning things right before our eyes. And I think part of the reason for that is that it's not human beings who are necessarily behind that anymore. It's about machines advancing machines right now, and who knows where that's going to lead. But so it's listening to you and it's watching you. So now when you're scrolling through Facebook or you're scrolling through Pinterest or whatever, and so now you're seeing 1,000 different pictures, a sampling of your interests, and it's going to see where your eyes glance and where you linger and where you don't linger. And now it's knowing, based off of hours of you using this, what to show you next. What might you want to stare at next? So there you go. There's another way. It's tracking your eye movements. Now, this is applicable commercially for when you, let's say, enter not only for ads, it'll serve you up ads that you want to look at and want to see, but it will also serve a purpose for like when you're entering a grocery store or any kind of store, and they'll know where to place ads, and like for augmented reality type stuff, and they'll know where to place products specifically tailored for you. And I think Amazon is working on this right now with their personless stores and stuff. It's a very interesting thing. They're going to be tracking your eye movements in the store. They're going to start adding things for to smell, and so these scents are going to trigger certain emotional states for you, and they're going to know what scent will trigger what state to make you more probable to buy what product. It's going to be a whole crazy thing. Now Owen thinks it can't happen because we're unpredictable, but we're not that unpredictable, right? Like I mean, there's so many instances to pull from, but like for example, if you were to insult your wife, it wouldn't be unpredictable for her to be mad at you, right? If you were to be really nice and do a whole bunch of extra nice things and so forth, you're going to understand that you're doing this with the idea that maybe she's going to be really nice back at you, right? So humans are not at all unpredictable. In fact, the reason why we have a society and a civilization is because we are so predictable, and because we have added to our psychological predictability things to make us more predictable, like the law. So there's punishments and there's rewards systems built into our society. These are social, but they're also legal, and so this helps us become more predictable. And this is how you can drive on a highway, for example, because people are predictable. Now, of course, there's always going to be some randomness, but by and large, we're not saying we're 100% predictable, that things are going to operate 100%, but for the most part, that's why we can function, is because of our predictability. Now, I can only play a few more minutes here, or else this is going to take forever to process for YouTube for some reason. So I'm going to let this go for a little bit longer, and then I have to wrap it up.
And there was a scene in House of Cards that I really liked in one season, where the big data guy, the metadata guy, the one that represented the person that helped get Obama elected with big data, and he was crazy, but like funny, genius crazy, and he was like listening to jazz, and he's like, you can't predict jazz. Who could have predicted that would come? The arrogance that comes from thinking you can predict the future is a lot like the Philosopher's Stone and a lot of these things, alchemy, the things that used to drive Newton crazy. I was going to title this episode Gold, God, and Google, but I didn't. And I'll tell you why, because Newton became obsessed with gold because he couldn't make it. And that's one of the reasons Newton was one of the people responsible for developing the idea of a gold-backed currency. Because Newton, a devout Christian and a physicist and a scientist, was trying to figure out how to make gold, the Philosopher's Stone, alchemy, you know? And he couldn't, so he realized it was stable. God is stable. God is God. You don't get to reinvent God. God isn't like a software update. It just is.
Really interesting, and this is a cool part he had here. I can't verify exactly the information that he has there, but again, let's just talk about it as if it's true. It's interesting how, you know, God is stable, gold is stable. These are things that are sort of universally sought and valued by humans around the world, and there's something to that. I think Jung started digging into that. Of course, Jung brought up the alchemists, and what they were really getting at was God, was a higher consciousness. And I'm not sure if Newton, you know, how into that Newton was, or how much Newton understood to that end, because Newton, of course, had a very scientific mind as well. So, yeah, I'm not sure, but I thought that was interesting how that all kind of fits together. And if you want to, you know, if you're interested in a lot of the political stuff here, and the gold stuff, and the Bitcoin stuff, and how that plays into a free society, look up something by Bastiat called The Law. That's one of the, for me, a life-changing book. It's kind of a short book, but it's devastating political philosophy, and it's also about economics, if you're into this kind of thing. Also, Frederick Hayek's The Road to Serfdom, also pretty devastating.
Same with gold. And so the Philosopher's Stone became fiat currency. This is the interesting thing about wizardry. Wizardry is real. Spells are real. People can say words, and people then can be shackled or set free. Rhetoric is spells. Like, I was watching some wizard movie or something, and all these wizards were like practicing with all these gibberish words. And growing up, I always just thought it was make-believe, but it isn't. It's learning rhetoric. It's learning how to say the words. Like, Barack Obama has said speeches that made me cry with hope. Barack Obama is a liar and a charlatan. And there's been times when the way he says words and the way that he would use these uplifting speech patterns, I would feel hope and strong emotions of love towards him. And then it would disappear, just like how spells work.
I think a stronger case for this, a couple of interesting cases, the speeches that Hitler gave. I mean, there's someone who mastered rhetoric and mastered the amplification of what the crowd was sort of telling him to say, and bringing it back at them, you know, times 10, and just having this crazy magical effect over people. It's almost demonic in that case. And then, well, certainly it was demonic. And then, of course, we have in the Bible, lux fiat, you know, let there be light. God created the world with words, the spoken word. And then we have the, you know, this whole idea in John about the logos and the word becoming flesh, and, you know, the power in that. and the power we see daily with words, how words can affect your mood, and you can affect others' moods. You can make someone commit suicide with your words, or you can raise them up instead of tear them down. You can raise them up as well. So there is this kind of magical psychological effect that we have with words. And I think Jordan Peterson brings up sometimes how women, classically speaking, mythologically speaking, have beauty on their side, and they can use that as a power over men in their youth. And then as they lose that, they have to use something else. And so many women are more verbally gifted than men, so they can use their words as a way to have power over men. And of course, it could be a self-protective power, or it could be a kind of a gossiping power, an evil power. But that's something Jordan has brought up. And I have to end this video now, or else it'll take way too long to process. But if you like these sort of commentaries that kind of bring together the communities I'm in Owen's community, I'm in Jordan Peterson's community, I'm certainly in Paul Vanderklay's community, and I think we're all kind of touching on the same kind of topics here and there. And so I think commenting on some of Owen's streams will be something I'm doing in the future, as well as perhaps commenting on Paul Vanderklay and whatever Jordan Peterson happens to be doing as well. So again, if you like this sort of thing, give this video a like and subscribe. Thank you.
Well, there's a guy who's got a little YouTube channel, and I've been sending a lot of people his way, Node in a Network, and he's basically been reading all of the stuff in the footnotes of Maps of Meaning,
where we're all sort of plugged in as like nodes on the network.
Node in a network, there's a good username.
A node in a network.
The wrong model, because you're at the center of a network. You're a node in a network.